Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me
Slavery is a system of forced labor that has existed throughout the world for thousands of years. In America, slavery began in the 17th century when people in Africa were overpowered and forced to leave their native land, their culture, and their families behind.
Europeans and others did not simply march into Africa and just take people off. I mean, there were battles, there were wars that were lost, by the British, by the French, by the Portuguese, as well as those which were won. You had males and females leading forces against the enslavers.
Europeans responded by coercing one tribe to enslave another, threatening to arm their enemies with terrifying new weapons if they did not cooperate. These tribal slave traders selected strong, healthy males and females between the ages of 18 and 35, although children were often captured as well. The African captives were chained together at the ankle or wrist, or linked at the neck by a wooden yoke. Once bound, the captives embarked on a grueling march, sometimes as long as 600 miles to the coast, where European ships awaited them. Many perished from the rigors of the trip. Others resisted their captors and were killed. The Atlantic crossing took from 4 to 8 weeks. Men, women, and children were crowded into tightly packed quarters. The ordeal was so demoralizing that the Africans often sank into a deep depression. Some chose death rather than to endure the degradation.
They attempted to escape on ships by simply, if the opportunity offered itself, by leaping off and drowning or whatever. Once they were bound by the continental United States, the protest took the form more of insurrection.
The first slaves in the American colonies, a cargo of about 20 Africans, arrived at Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The number of enslaved Africans increased steadily each year. By 1763, the colonial population included an estimated 230,000 Africans, most of them slaves in the South.
A slave was someone who could be forced to work from the age of 8, 6, 4 even, long hours at tasks that someone else decided. A slave was a person who had no right to a vacation. A slave was a person who had no rights to wages. A slave could have no property. A slave could not marry.
By the late 18th century, the textile industry had entered a period of rapid development in both England and in the northern United States. This growth created a tremendous demand for Southern cotton. In 1793, Eli Whitney developed the cotton gin, a machine that cleaned cotton 5 times faster than manual methods. As a result, more slaves were needed to pick and haul the cotton. By 1860, there would be 4 million African slaves in the United States. This enormous population of slaves was owned by a small group of the wealthiest and most powerful whites in American society. As African slaves toiled in the fields, laws were created to enforce their low status. They were prohibited from participating in lawsuits, from owning property or firearms, and from possessing alcohol. Most states did not recognize slave marriages and often prohibited slaves from learning to read and write. The treatment slaves received from their masters varied tremendously. Some owners were brutal sadists who worked their slaves mercilessly and threatened them with corporal discipline so painful that it amounted to torture.
And if you were ordered to do a task that you knew would be dangerous to you, you had to do it. So even though it's tempting to put poverty and slavery together, they were very different. And the difference is that enslaved workers had no rights.
A slave had no protection from this mistreatment because the law considered a slave another man's property, not a human being. When a slave suffered a whipping, he could neither fight back nor take his master to court. Slaves developed an independent culture unknown to their masters. They spun fantastic spoken narratives that passed from one generation to the next. These folk tales expressed the enslaved Africans' aspirations for a better life. Many slaves found strength to endure oppression through their religion, which blended Christianity with African beliefs.
Spirituality was a strong force in the life of the slave. Slaves could turn to God with all of their problems. Slaves could ask God to either relieve them of the burden of a brutal slave master or to free them from the day-to-day struggle in their lives.
At the core of slave society was the family. Slave families suffered when one member was sold to another plantation. Owners usually kept women and children together, selling off the father and sons. On the well-established plantations, black families had a better chance of remaining intact, some enduring for 3 or 4 generations. Although religion, folk tales, and family life softened the horrors of slavery, they did not lessen the humiliating aspects of servitude. Slaves sought more direct means of resisting their bondage through violent rebellion or subtle and covert acts of resistance.
You found people who were enslaved that resisted by working very slowly, pretending that they didn't know how to do something, accidentally breaking equipment, just slowing down the process, not happy-go-lucky going along with everything. These were all forms of resistance.
Wherever there were Africans in the Western Hemisphere, there were slave revolts. Haiti's Toussaint Louverture helped rid the island of European domination by organizing his people into a standing army of several thousand troops. The best-known slave revolt in U.S. history occurred in 1831 in Southampton, Virginia. It was led by a plantation headman named Nat Turner, who rose up in revolt with other slaves and killed the plantation owner and his family. The rampage was halted when local militia crushed the rebellion, capturing and executing Turner. Many men and women known as abolitionists worked unceasingly to end slavery. They viewed slavery as immoral and unchristian and could not comprehend how Americans, steeped in the tenets of the Declaration of Independence, could sanction the enslavement of human beings. Many former slaves, like Sojourner Truth, supported the abolitionist movement. She traveled widely, speaking for both racial and gender causes.
Sojourner Truth, using her very strong religious beliefs, felt this need, this urge to travel the country, delivering her message of upliftment for black people, and ultimately did become someone who was involved in many other activities, including the abolitionist movement, including the women's movement.
The abolitionist movement attracted members of both races, including